You're joining us for a BBC News special programme live in Kyiv, 4 years to the day since Russia launched its full-scale invasion of this country. Whether you're listening, watching or streaming this programme, you're very welcome. Over the next half hour, we're going to look at the impact that war here has had on Ukraine and in Russia too, and how realistic are any hopes for peace. Stay with us. Hello, I'm Lucy Hawkins. You're joining us live from the Lukiivnivska metro station in residential Kyiv. This station is a place that people come to for warmth when they've got no electricity at home and it is freezing cold. They come here too, though, for shelter to escape the bombardment. But this metro station has been hit 6 times in the past 4 years. And as I look around, I can see windows that are boarded up with plywood after being blown out from those blasts. The walls outside are pockmarked with shrapnel. And as you can see, it's rush hour here. The station is busy as normal life continues in Kyiv, even on such a solemn day for the city. Over the next few minutes, we're going to hear from those on the front line of the war, as well as from our Russia editor, Steve Rosenberg in Moscow, about the cost of the war, the public mood in Russia today. We're going to take stock of where diplomatic talks are with our international editor, Jeremy Bowen, also our State Department correspondent, Tom Bateman, and our Europe editor, Katia Adler. But let's start by reminding you of that moment 4 years ago that Russia launched its invasion.
We're live in Ukraine and the country at war after a huge Russian military offensive by land, sea and air. The onslaught began just before dawn with a barrage of missiles on multiple targets right across the country.
Here in Ukraine, the war has taken a massive toll. The Ukrainian government putting the official number of people killed since February the 24th, 2022 at 70,000. The unofficial numbers, though, are so much higher. The website Ukrainian Losses estimates the military death toll as more like 92,000. Many here, though, say that number is much higher. Casualties mounting in Russia as well. The Center for Strategic and International Studies reports that up to 325,000 Russians have been killed. And again, those figures could be much higher. A BBC investigation has been able to identify the names of about 200,000 Russians who have died. Well, Ukraine is a massive country. Just to remind you, this is the second largest country in Europe, and every corner of it has been touched by the war in some ways. We've heard so many heartbreaking stories, and one of them is this generation of babies who have been born to fathers killed on the front line. The BBC Ukrainian service has spoken to some of those now forced to raise their children single-handedly. This is one mother's story.
She is my little bun. Her eyes will be brown. They will be just like her dad's. He always dreamed we would have a girl. He used to say, "I'm going to have a daughter," but he never ever found out. His military knapsack. Here is his favorite watch. It beeps at certain times of the day. At first, I even talked to this watch. I thought it was my husband talking back to me. Sometimes the city gets hit by Russian missiles. At times, the bombings are really brutal. But I only started feeling scared when the baby was born. After my husband died, nothing could scare me anymore.
It's a heartbreaking day for so many people here in Ukraine as they reflect on what the past 4 years has been like. And with me here in Kyiv at the metro station is our Ukrainian service correspondent, Zhana Vespiachuk. Zhana, how are people feeling today?
Hello, Lucy. This is a very difficult question. After 4 years of the full-scale war, first of all, what it's important to mention that it's a very sad day for Ukrainians. These days, the Russian invasion on this particular day 4 years ago tore apart the lives of millions of people. And you can't forget this. And many people can't forgive this too. Why? Because, of course, first of all, what we have to remember on this particular day that so many families lost their loved ones. Tens of thousands both civilians and military were killed by this war, and just not far from where we are standing now. I remember this day very well. At the end of December 2023, just in a minute, 33 people were killed, all civilians, very, very close to this place where we are now. So that's the first point. But the other point is that, of course, I think today the biggest achievement, even the real win which Ukrainians feel they have already, that's that the sovereignty of Ukraine has been preserved, defended.
So what would people accept in terms of any kind of peace deal, Jana?
The first point is that the majority oppose the idea that Ukraine has to withdraw from the territories which are controlled now by Ukrainian forces in the east of Ukraine, and which Russia claims to get within the possible future peace deal, wants to get them. So this idea is rejected by the majority of people in this country, despite the huge costs and the entire pain that people have to go through. That's the first point. The other point, of course, the security guarantees is the key thing. So if we look at the polls, we can see that some people consider that territorial issue can be somehow solved in exchange for very firm and long-lasting security guarantees.
We're going to be talking about some of those security guarantees in the special program. Jana, thank you so much for being with us. Well, as we've heard, the conflict has moved at different paces over these past 4 years. There were those initial rapid gains by the Russian forces before being pushed back. And in the past 12 months, Russia's gains have been so much slower too. Just to give you an idea, at the current rate we're at now, there are estimates that suggest it would take more than 100 years for Russia to occupy all of Ukraine. Well, President Zelenskyy has relentlessly travelled the world. We've heard him so many times in capitals right around the world making the case for Ukraine. And this was his message to his people this morning.
One day I want to come here with the President of the United States. I know for certain, only by coming to Ukraine and seeing with one's own eyes our life and our struggle, feeling our people and the enormity of this pain, only then can one understand what this war is really about.
Well, let's take you to our international editor, Jeremy Bowen. He is here with us in Kyiv and has recently been to the front line. Jeremy, give us an idea of how fierce the fighting is on the front line and also how you expect the next year to unfold.
Well, it's constantly tense. Drones are first and foremost the weapon of choice for both sides in that area. They're now, instead of there being a precise front line as you might have thought of in the past, a confrontation line, there's now what they refer to as a kill zone, about 20 kilometers back either side from that line of confrontation, where drones rule the roost, where it's really dangerous to move on the ground, and where they are using ground drones to carry wounded and supplies rather than risk the lives of soldiers moving around in that atmosphere. What I would say is I don't get any sense that the Ukrainians are about to collapse in any way, nor do I get any sense that the Russians, despite the fact they are grinding forward really, really slowly, that they have the capacity or the ability, the number, the necessary proficient troops to break through and to exploit that breakthrough. So I think in terms of that battlefield, it's pretty static, but of course it's a big feature in, as you've been discussing, in the ceasefire talks officiated over by the Americans in Geneva, because of course the Russians, and they've had some support from the Americans in this, are saying, well, that 20% of Donetsk, which is where I was, which is still in the hands of the Ukrainians, they'd like it, please.
And Jeremy, when you talked to President Zelenskyy this week and sat down with him, how was he? What was it like talking to him? And what did he say about those prospects for peace?
Well, I find him incredibly buoyant, to be honest. I mean, the man has a lot of energy despite 4 years in a really hard job, living behind really extreme security, moving around the world. And of course, you can't fly in and out of this country. He's got to get a 12-hour train to get close to the Polish border to get out. So I think that he's someone who said to me anyway, he said, look, Ukraine, can win this war, of course, with the support of its allies, partners as he called them. And he also said, when I asked him about the fear certainly that President Joe Biden used to have about President Putin's nuclear saber rattling, fears of a possible third world war, well, at that point, President Zelenskyy said, Putin's already started the Third World War, and what Ukraine is doing, in his opinion, is essentially stopping Putin and Russia from expanding it further. There are question marks. Would they have the capacity to do that? What they absolutely do have, of course, is a huge nuclear arsenal. And it's certainly my analysis that Putin's got too much at stake in this war. He's not going to stop it unless he can get something which he can hold up as a significant victory. And that's something which I think Zelenskyy does not want to give him.
Jeremy, thank you. Well, let's now turn to Russia. We are getting reports that Russia has suffered more injuries and deaths than any major power in any war since World War II. But in the face of mounting casualties, President Putin shows absolutely no sign of backing down. Let's have a listen to him speaking earlier.
They can't inflict a strategic defeat on Russia. They just can't. But they want it so badly. They can't live without it, or at least they think they can't. They are determined to inflict Russia a defeat and are looking for any method, absolutely any. They will push themselves to some extreme point and then regret it.
Live to Moscow now, let's talk to our Russia editor, Steve Rosenberg. Steve, what's your sense around the public mood there at the moment?
Lucy, when I talk to Russians in the towns and the villages and the cities that we visit, it's not we're pushing for victory that I hear most. It's we're hoping for peace or some kind of negotiated settlement. I think there's a real sense of fatigue here after 4 years of war. And that is because I think more and more Russians are being impacted by this war. First of all, the human cost. I think more and more people know family members or friends or relatives or neighbours or friends of friends who have been fighting in Ukraine, but also people are being hit by the economic effects of 4 years of war and 4 years of sanctions. So prices are higher in the shops, utility bills are going up, taxes are going up. And I went to a town, a 6-hour drive from Moscow the other day, and everybody was talking about higher prices and higher utility bills. Not everyone connects that with the war, but I think more and more people are.
Steve, I know you hate being asked what Vladimir Putin is thinking, but is there any sense that he is close to wanting to end this war?
I think that Vladimir Putin would be happy to sit down tomorrow and sign a peace deal if that peace deal was on his terms, and if that peace deal meant the capitulation of Ukraine, that he'd be happy to do that. Otherwise, he gives the impression of being a man who wants to continue with this war, despite the fact that it has not gone at all according to plan, this special military operation, despite the huge battlefield casualties that Russia has suffered, and they are huge. I mean, no official figures are released here on numbers, but you know, wherever we go, we see monuments to Russian soldiers who've been killed in Ukraine. There are special sections at cemeteries in many towns and villages of soldiers who were killed in Ukraine. So clearly a lot of people have been killed. He is determined to push on, I think, because he believes that in this war of attrition, Russia has the staying power and will prevail in the end.
Steve, thank you. Steve Rosenberg, our Russia editor there live in Moscow. A reminder, if you're just joining us, this is a special programme on the BBC News website, TV, radio and audio services. 4 years since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Well, let's turn now to global efforts to bring the conflict to an end. And one of the most shocking moments was that White House meeting, you'll remember it, between President Trump and President Zelenskyy this time last year. It was such an explosive encounter, beamed around the world with the two men arguing in front of the cameras. And there was also that meeting between President Trump and Putin in Alaska, which has led to further diplomatic talks, but no big breakthrough. And it's the US, of course, that is so key to unlocking any diplomatic progress. So let's take you to Tom Bateman, who is the BBC State Department correspondent who has been covering this for months now. Tom, where do you think President Trump is at with all of this? Because in the past we've seen him accusing President Zelenskyy of being the problem. Do you think that the White House believes that it can actually deliver a breakthrough now?
Well, it's certainly been pushing, it would say, both Russia and Ukraine to do so. But the reality about this, Lucy, is, and I've seen this repeatedly now from within the administration, is officials believe that the president's increasingly frustrated with Volodymyr Zelenskyy. Basically, there are those in the administration at senior levels who have seen, and you played that tape there, what amounted basically to an ambush of the Ukrainian president last year in the Oval Office, who see Mr. Zelenskyy as recalcitrant, as not moving on this issue of territory, which is in the end the core block to progress in these now trilateral talks between Russia and Ukraine, with the Americans there, they say, as mediators, and another set of talks due to take place, we think, this Thursday in Geneva. But all of that is a sign, remember, of how fundamentally the US administration has shifted from the Biden position into the Trump administration over this war. The removal of American-funded military weapons support for Ukraine, its ally, or what was its ally in this war, the re-engagement of the Russian leadership by the Americans, bringing them back onto the world stage. And I think that all talks to a much deeper shift that we're now seeing in great clarity from the Americans, which is about the principle that has existed, the West has said, has always backed, the Americans have backed it, on paper at least, since the end of the Second World War, the idea of territorial integrity, that big countries shouldn't just be allowed to swallow up smaller and weaker ones. And I think we're now seeing in multicolour the American abandonment of that principle. And this is what is really worrying the Europeans, that they're going to push the Ukrainian leadership into having to capitulate on that 20% of their own country, giving up parts of the Donbass that the Russians do not even occupy at the moment, that is still under Ukrainian control. And the biggest signal, I think, in the last couple of months to the Europeans and the Ukrainians, the Americans are really ditching that historical principle, was over the issue of Greenland. President Trump's willingness, his desire to try and annex Greenland, even the implicit and then really the explicit threat of force against his own allies to do that. And so the Europeans and the Ukrainians have looked at that and said, well, clearly the Americans have shifted that far that the idea of backing, the idea of a principle of trying to deter future territorial takeover is not one the Americans are prepared to support. What they want is a deal. They want to bring the Russians back onto the world stage. They see it in America's economic interests to do that. And fundamentally, I think that's why the Ukrainians are feeling more of the pressure at the moment.
Tom, thank you so much. Well, let's talk more about some of what Tom just raised and the established global order that has been upended by the war in Ukraine, because this is a conflict that's led to a huge realignment in Europe, changing the landscape in terms of defence spending, as Tom was saying, and security as well. There was an extraordinary show of solidarity from European leaders in the wake of that Trump-Putin summit we were discussing, putting on a united front at the White House and making the case for Ukraine. Let's take you to Katia Adler, who is our Europe editor. Katia, what extent do you think, because it is remarkable to see all the European leaders who are in Kyiv today, what extent do you think that this is a war that is really uniting Europeans now?
I think it's, from top to bottom, really, because definitely from the population of Europe, there was an outpouring of empathy, sympathy for the Ukrainians. And just think about how many Ukrainians who felt forced to leave their homeland and look for shelter elsewhere have been taken in across the continent. I don't know if you can see that big arch behind me in central Brussels there, lit up in the colours of the Ukrainian flag. I think, though, in the last 4 years, there have been four main uniting effects in Europe, Lucy, definitely from a defence and security point of view, because you may remember 4 years ago, so many European countries said, no, Vladimir Putin, he's never going to do this. He's never going to launch this full-scale invasion of Ukraine. It just doesn't make sense. And he did. And it's become the biggest conflict on this continent since the Second World War. That certainly woke Europeans up. Number two, there's a real realization, you hear it from Volodymyr Zelenskyy over and over again, that Russia needs to be defeated in Ukraine. Otherwise, Vladimir Putin will also be tempted to look elsewhere in Europe. There's a realization across Europe, particularly those countries that neighbour Russia, that are in the Russian neighbourhood, whether it's the Baltic states, also the Nordic states, Poland, who really feel the cold there and who say this is an attempt by Vladimir Putin not just to take Ukraine, just of course in inverted commas, but also to reorganise the security infrastructure in place in Europe since the end of the Cold War. What does that mean? Well, it means that this continent has become increasingly Western focused since the end of the Cold War, and Vladimir Putin doesn't like that. He wants to change it, and that has united European minds in a way of how to stop it. Another thing that has brought Europeans together is Donald Trump. Very clearly under Donald Trump, as we were just hearing there from Tom Bateman, he has made it very clear to Europeans they can no longer just rely on the US for their security and defence as they have done for decades and decades. So they need to take responsibility themselves. They need to think about joint procurement programmes, particularly through NATO, for example. It's also healed rifts like Brexit. After the UK left the EU, there was a lot of bitterness between many other European countries and the UK. That has disappeared because the UK has taken a leading role in supporting Ukraine, and that has also helped bring European countries together.
And briefly, Katia, tell us a bit more about that, about the money, because there's been this huge impact on defence spending. What role do you see Europe playing in the future of Ukraine?
It's already playing a massive role, Lucy, because we don't have direct military aid anymore from the United States. It was the biggest donor beforehand, before Donald Trump returned to the White House. You still have old contracts from the Biden administration where they're still being delivered. Lots of American weaponry and armaments coming still to Ukraine, paid for by the Europeans. So defence, but also reconstruction. Ukraine will be looking to the Europeans really to carry the biggest burden, even though the Europeans say, well, Russia should pay reparations. And just a very quick word on Ukraine. Admiration across the continent. 4 years ago, when Russia launched that full-scale invasion behind closed doors, many European leaders just thought Ukraine wouldn't last. And now, look, it is leading the way in drone technology, modern warfare in so many ways. So it's not just Ukraine looking to Europeans. Europeans are looking to Ukraine to learn from them from a military perspective as well.
Katia, thank you so much. That solidarity around Europe is really being felt here in Kyiv today. But the other thing is, throughout the war, there have been some iconic moments of courage and resistance. And most recently, we saw it at the Winter Olympic Games, when a Ukrainian skeleton racer was banned for wearing a helmet, which showed the faces of Ukrainian athletes killed in the war. He joined me here at the metro station in Kyiv just a short time ago.
The idea was to honor my fellow athletes, and I believe also for them. Many of them were Olympians, some of them were representative of Olympic sports. And I think for them it was, in some point of life, it was a dream to be an Olympian. And my idea was to bring them with me on a competition day, so they also can take part on these Olympic Games. And also, of course, it's a way to honor their families. And I think for families, it was very important. I read already some comments from the media, from family members, and they were very thankful for that. And I think for me, it was the biggest win.
Really lovely to speak to him just a short time ago, talking to me about how important that moment was for him at the Olympics to represent Ukraine, to be seen really as, holding the memories of those that have died, telling people around the world what is happening here. Well, when Vladimir Putin sent his military across the border into Ukraine, it's thought he expected to overrun this country within 10 days. Some even thought Ukraine would be under Russian control before that first week was out. But here we are, 4 years to the day since that full-scale invasion began. It's been 4 years of missile and drone attacks, 4 years of these massive power outages. People have been left freezing at night through this bitter cold winter. 4 years of suffering as well. And as Volodymyr Zelenskyy told the BBC this week, Ukraine is still here. More peace talks are expected at the end of this week. But for the people of this country, tomorrow, they will wake up in a country that is still at war. Thank you for joining us here in Kyiv.